Right, in this episode of Jordan Peterson's biblical series, we look at the story of Abraham. Now looking at it through the difficult obstacles that he faces, the difficulties, the challenges, but also seeing how Abraham is able during that time to make the proper sacrifices. Those sacrifices leading him to the promise that he will become the father of a great nation.
This has been a very steep learning curve for me with regards to these stories because I didn't understand them very well. And I've got better at using the resources online to help me do my background investigation. I have a lot of books, and some of you may have noticed that online I posted a conversation I had with Jonathan Pageau and his brother Matthew. I hope it's Matthew. Names escape me so badly, but I believe that's right. He just finished a book on the Bible, and so I've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about these stories, trying to understand what they're about. And then there's all these commentaries. There's a great site, I think it's called Bible Hub, that has every single verse of the Bible is listed there, and then with each verse they've aggregated 10 commentaries from over the last 400 years. And so there's like a dense page on every line. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about this book too, is that it's aggregated so much commentary that it's much bigger than it looks. The book is much bigger than it looks. And so it's been very interesting to become familiar with those too. And the fact that this site is set up with all the commentaries split up by verses means you can rapidly compare the commentaries and get a sense of, how people have interpreted this over, well, at least several hundred years, but of course much longer than that, because the people who wrote the commentaries were, of course, reading things that were older than that. So that's been very, very interesting. So last week we talked about a couple of things. We talked about how you might understand the idea of a divine encounter. And then we also paralleled that with the idea that God disappears in the Old Testament. He bows out as the stories progress, and that seems to be an emergent property of the sequencing of the stories, right? Because all the books were written by independent people, different people, and then they were aggregated by other people. And so the narrative continuity is some kind of emergent property that's a consequence of this interaction between people, readers and writers over centuries. And it's strange that given that there are also multiple coherent narratives that unite it, it's really not that easy to understand that, but it does at least seem to be the case. And the third thing we talked about was that as God bows out, so to speak, the individual personality seems of the characters that are involved, the human characters that are involved, seems to become more and more developed. And it isn't exactly clear what it means is that God steps away and man steps forward. That's what it means. But why it's arranged like that, or the say ultimate significance of that, is by no means clear. And so Abraham, who we're going to concentrate on today, is quite a well-developed character. And I would say there are multiple endings and beginnings in the biblical stories. The most important ending, I suppose, is the ending of the Garden of Paradise and the disenchantment of the world and the sending forth of Adam and Eve into history, right, into the future, into a mode of being that has a future as part of it, and that has history as part of it, and that has the necessity of sacrifice and toil as part of it. That's obviously crucial. And then that is replayed with the story of Noah, because everything is destroyed and then the world is created anew, and then sacrifices have to be made in order for the world to begin. And then you see the same thing happen again after the Noah story in the Tower of Babel, because history, as we really understand history, seems to start with Abraham, because the stories of Abraham sound like historical stories. And scholars debate about the historical accuracy of the Bible, and I suppose there's no way of ever determining once and for all the degree to which you might regard the accounts as equivalent to modern empirical history. But this is a psychological interpretation of the biblical stories, not a historical interpretation. And it certainly does seem to be the case that from a psychological perspective, we enter something like the domain of the modern conceptualization, relatively modern conceptualization of history with Abraham. Beyond the accounts of divine commands that Abraham carries out, this is from Friedman, the man I mentioned in the last lecture, who wrote The Disappearance of God and a variety of other books that are well worth reading. The narrative also includes a variety of stories in which Abraham acts on his own initiative. He divides land with his nephew Lot. He battles kings. He takes concubines. He argues with his wife Sarah. On 2 occasions, he tells kings that Sarah is his sister out of fear that they will kill him to get his wife. He arranges his son's marriage. In the place of the single story of Noah's drunkenness, there are, in the case of Abraham, the stories of a man's life. And one of the things I was really struck by reading this in depth and reading the commentary is how much like a story about a person it is. You know, Abraham isn't a divine figure in any archetypal sense precisely. I mean, he has archetypal elements because he's also obviously the founder of a nation. But fundamentally, he's a human being, and he has the adventures and he makes the mistakes of a human being. And it's the mistake part that really struck me, you know, because I was talking with a friend of mine this week, Norman Deutsch, who's a very remarkable person in many ways, and he was taking me to task. He was reading my book, which I'm going to publish, or which will be out in January. And in the book, in one section, I contrasted the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament, and made the case, sort of based on Northrop Frye's ideas, that the God of the Old Testament was really harsh and judgmental, you know, and that the God of the New Testament was more merciful and, you know, at least to some degree, more sweetness and light. And Norman took me to task about that, saying that that was an overly Christianized interpretation, which would make sense because I derived it in part from Northrop Frye. And I really have come to understand that more, that he's right, that he's right about that, because the God in the Old Testament is actually far more merciful than he's generally made out to be. And you really see this it's good news fundamentally if you regard the representation of God as somehow key to the description of being itself. I mean, Abraham makes a lot of mistakes, you know, serious mistakes, and yet he has a life, and he's blessed by God despite the fact that he's pretty deeply flawed and engages in deceptive practice. I mean, he's a good man, but he's not a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination, and things work out really well for him, and he's the founder of a nation and all of that. And that's good news for everyone, because perfect people are very, very hard to find, and if the only pathway to having a rich and meaningful life was through perfection, then we would all be in deep trouble. And so that's very satisfying to read that. And the other thing that I've been struck by is that, you know, Abraham, and I think this is actually absolutely key to the interpretation of the story, Abraham goes out and does things. That's the thing. And so one of the things that I've noticed in my life is that nothing I've ever done was wasted. And by done, I mean put my heart and soul into, you know, like attempted with all of my effort. That always worked. Now, it didn't always work the way I expected it to work. That's a whole different issue. But the payoff from it was always positive. Something of value always accrued to me when I made the sacrifices necessary to do something worthwhile. And so I think part of the message in the story in the Abrahamic stories is go do something. And I've thought about this in a variety of ways outside of the interpretation of this story, because I have this program some of you might be familiar with, which is called the Future Authoring Program, and it's designed to help people make a plan for 3 to 5 years into the future, you know. And so what you do is you answer some questions. It's a writing program. You answer some questions about how you would like your life to be and what you would like your character to be 3 to 5 years down the road, if you were taking care of yourself like you were taking care of someone that you actually cared about. So you kind of have to split yourself into two people and treat yourself like someone you have respect for and that you want the best for. And that's not easy, because people don't necessarily have respect for themselves, and they don't necessarily want what's the best for themselves, because they have a lot of self-contempt and a lot of self-hatred and a lot of guilt and a lot of existential angst and a lot of self-consciousness and all of that, and so people don't necessarily take care of themselves very well, and I think you have an obligation. It's one of the highest moral obligations to treat yourself as if you're a creature of value, and that is in some sense that's independent of your actions, and you might think about that metaphorically as a recognition of your divine worth in the biblical sense, regardless of your sins, so to speak. And I think that's powerful language as far as I'm concerned once you understand it. Anyways, with the self-authoring program, the future authoring program, you answer questions about how you would like your friendships to be conducted. Because it's useful to surround yourself with people who are trying to move forward and more importantly, who are happy when you move forward and not happy when you move backwards. Not when you fall, that isn't what I mean, but when you're doing self-destructive things, your friends shouldn't be there to cheer you on. And because then they're really not acting like friends, obviously. I know it's obvious, but it still happens all the time and people allow it to happen. It's not a good idea. And how would you like to sort your family out? And I was thinking about this week too, because I was thinking about Noah's Ark, and there was a phrase in that story that I didn't understand, which was that Noah was perfect in his generations. I thought, I don't know what that means. And when you're going through a book like the Bible, if you don't understand a phrase, that actually means you've missed something. It doesn't mean that that's just not, that's not germane to the story. It means you're stupid. You didn't get it, man. You didn't get it. You didn't understand it. And so the idea that Noah was perfect in his generations, and that's why he could build an ark that would sustain him and humanity itself through the flood, it meant that not only did he walk with God, which is something that we talked about in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, but that he established proper relationships with his family, with his children. And so what that meant was that not only was he well integrated as a person, but his level of integration had reached the point where it stretched out beyond him and encompassed his family. And so it was Noah and the family that was in the ark. And I can tell you, and I really understood this year because I had a very tumultuous year. You could think about it from a personal perspective. I could think about it as a year that had no shortage of floods. And part of the reason that I was able to get through it, I also had terrible health problems, and one of the reasons I was able to get through it was because my family really came together around me, my kids, my wife, my parents, and my friends as well, and particularly a certain group of friends. And that's partly, all of that came together in my mind this week, and I thought, oh, that's what it means to be perfect in his generations. Meant that he hadn't just straightened himself out, he'd also straightened out his relationships with his family. And I can tell you that when crisis strikes you, which it will, the flood will come, right? That's why the apocalypse is always upon us. The flood will definitely come in your life. And to the degree that you've organized yourself psychologically and also healed the relationships between you and your family, that could be the critical element that determines whether you live or die when a crisis comes, or whether someone in your family lives or dies. And so the idea of the ark containing the man who walks with God and whose generations are perfect, and that's what sustains humanity through the crisis. It's like you couldn't be more psychologically accurate than that. And the other thing I was thinking about this week, I was thinking about another line in the New Testament. I think it's from the Sermon on the Mount, but I'm not absolutely sure. Christ compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed. And so I was thinking about, a mustard seed is a very tiny seed, and it grows into quite a spectacular, complex plant. And I was thinking about how you should operate in the world in order to make it a better place, assuming that that's what you should be doing. And that is what you should be doing. And there's lots in the world to fix. Everything that bothers you about the world and about yourself should be fixed. And you can do that. And my dawning realization, I have a friend, he lives in Montreal, his name is James Simon. He's a great painter, and he's taught me a lot of things. He's helped me design my house and beautify it. And I bought some paintings from him a couple of years ago, and he did this series of paintings where he went around North America and stood in different places, and then he painted the view from here down. And so it's his feet planted in different places, on roads, in the desert, on the ocean. I have one actually hanging over my toilet, which is him standing at a urinal. Yeah, well, he was trying to make a point, and the point was that wherever you are, it's worth paying attention. And that's because, so all these places that he visited, he looked at exactly where he was, standing by the side of the road in the desert. Sort of mundane in some sense, but then maybe he put 40 hours into that painting, and it's very, very realistic painting with really good light. And what he's telling you as a painter is everything is worth paying attention to an infinite amount, but you don't have enough time. And so the artist does that for you, right? The artist looks and looks and looks and looks and looks and then gives you that vision. And so then you can look at the painting and it reminds you that right where you are there's everything that there is right where you are. And that's a hard thing to realize, but it's actually true. And so I've been telling people online in various ways and in lectures that they should start fixing up the world by cleaning up their room. And I wanted to just elaborate on that a little bit before I get back to the lecture itself. So, as it's become this weird internet meme, and it's a joke, and good, it's a joke. I'm really happy about the fact that so much of this has got like the leaven of humor in it. It's really important, because that's what stops things from degenerating into conflict, humor. And I was thinking about this idea of cleaning up your room in relationship to the mustard seed idea. And you see, the thing about cleaning up your room, this is also something I learned from Carl Jung and his studies on alchemy, because for Jung, when the alchemist was attempting to make the philosopher's stone, he was not only engaged in the transformation of the material world, but he was engaged in a process of self-transformation that occurred at the same time as the chemical transformation. So it was a psychological work in some sense. Let's say you want to sort out your room and beautify it, because the beauty is also important. And let's say that all you have is just a little room, like you're not rich, you're poor, and you don't have any power. That's another thing. But you've got your damn room, and you've got this space right in front of you, that's a part of the cosmos that you can come to grips with. And you might think, well, what's there in front of you, right in front of you? And the answer to that is, it depends on how open your eyes are. That's the proper answer, because you could say, and William Blake said this, for example, and Aldous Huxley made comments that were very similar, that in a transcendent state, you can see infinity in the finite. And you might say, well, you can see infinity in what you have within your grasp if you look. And you could say, maybe that's the case with your room. And so you want to clean up your room. Well, okay, how do you do that exactly? Well, a room is a place to sleep. And so if you set your room up properly, then you figure out how to sleep and when you should sleep and how you should sleep. And then you figure out when you should wake up. And then you figure out, well, what clothes you should wear, because they have to be arranged properly in your dresser. And then you have to have some place to put your clothes. And if you're going to have some clothes, you have to figure out what you're going to wear those clothes to do, right? And then that means you have to figure out what you're going to do. And then your room has to serve that purpose, because otherwise it isn't set up properly. And if it doesn't serve your purposes, you will be unhappy and not happy in the room, because the way that we perceive the world is as a place to move from point A to point B in. And then if the place that we're in facilitates that movement, then we're happy to be there. And if the place that we're in serves as an obstacle to that movement, then we're unhappy to be there. And so what it means to set up your room is that you have to have somewhere to go that's worthwhile, or you can't set up your room, and then your room has to be set up to facilitate that. And then the next thing is, well, maybe you have to make it beautiful. But that's not easy, right? That means you have to have some taste. And that doesn't mean you have to have money. It doesn't, because you can be garish with money, and you can be tasteful with nothing. All you need is taste, and taste beats money when it comes to beautifying things. I mean, not that money is trivial, because it's not, but taste is crucial. And people who are very artistically oriented can make beautiful things out of virtually nothing. And not only that, the literature suggests that if you're going to make beautiful things, putting real constraints on what you allow yourself to do facilitates creativity instead of interfering with it. Because let's say you have to make something out of nothing, right? Which I suppose would be a godly act, right? You have to make something out of nothing. You have to be creative in order to do that. And so then to beautify your room means that you also have to develop your capacity to be creative. And so then you can make your room shine. But then what will happen is that if your family isn't together, they will interfere with that. You'll interfere with that, because you won't have the discipline to do it properly. But then when you start building this little microcosm of perfection with what you have at hand, then it'll evoke all the pathologies of everyone in your household. They'll wonder what the hell you're up to in there. And they won't necessarily be happy, because if they're in a lowly place, let's say, and so are you, and you're trying to move out of that, then the higher you move out of that, the more the place they're in looks bad. And you might say, well, what they should do is celebrate your victory over chaos and evil, but that isn't what will happen. What will happen instead is that they will attempt to pull you back down. They'll attempt to, and I mean, obviously all families don't do that, but all families do that to some degree, and some families do almost nothing but that. And so what that means is that if you're going to organize your room, then you're going to have to confront the devils in your house. And that's often that's often a terrifying thing, because some of those devils have lineages that go back many, many, many generations, and God only knows what you have to struggle with in order to overcome that. And so to sort yourself out and to fix up your room is a non-trivial matter, you know, and you can do that. You'll learn by doing that, and then maybe you'll learn enough by doing that so that you can fix up your family a little bit, and then having done that, you'll have enough character so that when you try to operate in the world, at your job, or maybe in the broader social spheres, that you'll be a force for good instead of harm, because you'll have learned some humility by noting just how difficult it was to put your damn room together, well, and yourself for that matter. And so you'll proceed cautiously with your eyes open towards the good. And so, well, those are some of the things I've been thinking about this week, and they're germane. They're germane to what we're going to discuss tonight, because what happens at the beginning of the Abrahamic stories is basically God comes to Abraham and just says, go, get going, man, do something, get going. And you might think, well, where should I go? And God is somewhat vague about that, and where he sends Abraham, it's a real fixer-upper, man. It's like there's starvation there, and there's tyranny, and there's marital dissolution, and there's deceit. Like it's just like where you live, you know. It's exactly the same thing. It's tyranny and catastrophe. So that's, you know, the tyrannical great father, because Abraham ends up having to sojourn in Egypt, and there's a famine, and so Mother Nature is on the rampage, and Abraham lies about his wife, as we'll see. And so it's the world, it's tyranny and vulnerability and deceit. And yet God says, go.